There are things in this country that don't show up on any map, hollows the road doesn't bend toward, names the census never carried twice. I'm going to tell you about one of those tonight, and I want you to do something for me before we go in, wherever you're listening from. Leave the name of your town in the comments below. I like to know who's down in the dark with me. New listener, old listener, all the same here. A note before this one begins. If what you're about to hear is the kind of story you'd want more of, I've put 10 of them into an audiobook. The Hollow Files, 5 hours, 10 counties. Same voice as the one you're listening to now. You'll find the link in the description and at the top of the comments. Now then, the story. In the spring of 1798, a man named Cornelius Threlkeld walked west out of the Shenandoah Valley with a wife, 2 oxen, and 1 cracked iron pot. He was 31 years old. He had no money, no people waiting for him, and only the vaguest idea of where he was going. What he had was a piece of paper from a land office in Winchester that promised him 160 acres on the far side of a ridge nobody had bothered to name. He found the ridge in late June. He found the hollow on the other side of it in early July. And he found the well, near as anyone could tell, 3 days after that. The well was already there when Cornelius arrived. That was the thing nobody talked about later, when the talking started. The stones around the mouth were the size of a man's chest, fitted together without mortar, and worn smooth in a way that didn't fit the 100 or so years white settlers had been in that part of the country. Cornelius noted the well in his almanac in a neat hand. He wrote, "Good water, cold, deep, no need to dig." He didn't write anything about who might have stacked those stones, or when, or why a well would be there at all in a hollow with no sign of any cabin, any clearing, any old hearthstones. He was a practical man. The well saved him weeks of work in a season where weeks of work could mean the difference between living and not. I have read his almanac. It survived. The Threlkelds, for all their other strangenesses, were keepers. They kept records the way some families keep silver. I found Cornelius's almanac in the county museum 2 ridges over in a glass case, on loan from a man in Pikeville who claimed to be a distant cousin and who would not return my letters when I tried to write to him in 1955. The almanac is a small book, the size of my hand. Cornelius wrote in iron gall ink in a tight, even script, and the entries from that first summer are the entries of a man too busy and too tired to imagine anything. Tuesday, cleared the lower ground, found chestnut roots harder than expected. Wednesday, Drusilla unwell from the heat, gave her water from the well, which steadied her. Thursday, the well water is cold even in this weather. The cold goes through a tin cup. I do not understand how, in a hollow this shallow, the water is this cold. That last entry is the only thing he ever wrote about the well that wasn't simply useful, and he didn't go back to it. He didn't speculate. He moved on to the chestnut roots, and the lower ground, and the question of whether he could get a second mule before winter. He drank from it that first afternoon, on his knees, scooping the water up in his hat. His wife, Drusilla Threlkeld, drank from it that evening from a tin cup. By the end of that first summer, they had a cabin, a garden, and the beginnings of what people in the next county would come to call Stonepenny Hollow. The name didn't come from Cornelius. He never named the place. The name came later from a peddler who said the stones around that well looked like big flat coins stacked on edge, the kind you'd find in a dead man's pocket. I should tell you what Cornelius looked like, because it matters in a way that won't become clear until later. He was a long, narrow man, pale across the cheekbones, hair the color of wet rope, and his eyes were a particular shade of light brown, the kind of brown that goes almost yellow in certain light, like a held-up glass of cider. There's a portrait of him hanging in the county museum 2 ridges over, painted in 1811 by a traveling man who took a meal and a bed in exchange for the work. You can still see those eyes in the painting, behind the cracked varnish. That's important. Hold on to it. Cornelius and Drusilla had one son who lived past his first winter. They named him Absalom. He was born in the spring of 1803 in the cabin in the hollow, drank well water from a bottle his mother soaked a rag in, and grew up tall and quiet and useful. Drusilla, for her part, lived a long life by the standards of that country and that time. She died in 1847 in her late 70s, having outlived her husband by 9 years. There is one record of her speech that survives. A neighbor's son, a man named Eldridge Burcham, who later moved to Ohio and became a printer, wrote down a story about visiting the hollow as a young man in the 1830s and hearing the old woman Drusilla Threlkeld say, "Of her well, the water remembers everybody who drinks it." He thought she was making a joke. He laughed. She did not laugh, he wrote, and she did not look at him when he laughed. And he never went back to the hollow again, which is the recurring shape of every outsider's account of Stone Penny Hollow that I have ever been able to find. They go in. Something small happens. They do not go back. By the time Absalom was a grown man, in the 1820s, the hollow had 4 families in it. By the time he buried his father in the 1830s, it had 11. And by the time Absalom himself was an old man, putting his own son Lorenzo in charge of the homestead, the hollow was a small, sealed-off community of maybe 60 people, almost all of them either Threlkelds or married into the Threlkelds or beholden to the Threlkelds. In some way, the law down in the county seat had never quite figured out how to write down. They all drank from the well. That was the first rule of the hollow, and nobody had to say it out loud. You could keep a cistern for the wash, you could catch rain for the garden, but the water you drank, the water you cooked with, the water you gave to anybody who came up sick, that water came from the stone, well in the middle of the hollow, the Threlkeld well, the well Cornelius had found in 1798, which is to say, the well that had been waiting in that hollow for nobody knew how long before that. In 1842, a Methodist circuit rider passed through Stone Penny Hollow on his way to a camp meeting in Logan County. His name was Reverend Phineas Ott. He kept a journal, and the journal eventually made its way into the archives of a small Bible college in Ohio, where I read it on a microfilm reader in the autumn of 1956. That's how I know what I know about this family, that and what came after. The Reverend Ott wrote about the hollow in a careful, worried hand. He said the people there were polite. He said they fed him well. He said the cabins were clean and the people were respectful, and the singing in the little log chapel on Sunday was, in his exact words, more solemn than is the custom even among the most pious mountain congregations. But he wrote one other thing. He wrote, "The eyes of the Threlkeld family disturb me. Old Absalom and his son Lorenzo and Lorenzo's wife, and even the cousins married in, have a sameness about the eye that I cannot explain. The color is wrong somehow. As if the brown of an ordinary eye had been steeped too long in a pot and turned the color of strong tea, and then turned again toward something I have no word for." He wrote more than that, actually. I read every page of his journal. The microfilm was scratched, and the ink was faded, and there were entries I had to puzzle over with a magnifying lens for an hour at a time. But there was one passage that has stayed with me, and I want to read it to you now, more or less the way he wrote it. Sunday evening in the Threlkeld house. Absalom, the patriarch, asked me if I had ever drawn water from a well so deep that the bucket came back colder than the air around it. I said I had not. He smiled in the firelight and said, "Then you have never had real water, Reverend." He said it kindly. There was no boast in it. He said it the way a man tells a younger man that the younger man has never tasted the apples from the high orchard. And his eyes in the firelight were not the eyes of any man I have met in a long life of meeting men. That was 1842. Generation 2, and Generation 3. 40-some years into the drinking. I want you to think about that for a moment. Because Cornelius's eyes had been the color of cider in 1811, when the traveling man painted him. By 1842, the eyes of his son and his grandson had gone past tea, into something Reverend Ott couldn't name, and nobody in the hollow had noticed, because the change had happened slow over 2 generations, and because they all had the same eyes now, looking at each other every morning, and there was nobody from outside who stayed long enough to see what they were becoming. Nobody except Reverend Ott. And he left after 3 nights and never came back, and only wrote about it in a journal. Nobody read until 114 years later, when a county surveyor from over in Mingo started asking questions. There were others too. I want you to know I did not build this whole story on one Methodist preacher's journal. In the years between 1941 and 1956, I found 4 more outside accounts of Stone Penny Hollow. A peddler's bill of sale from 1861 with a note on the back. A surveyor's report from 1888 with a hand-drawn map and a paragraph the surveyor had crossed out so hard the paper had torn underneath. A Pinkerton field memo from 1903, when a railroad company had briefly considered running a spur up that valley and had sent a man to look at the population. A letter from a county doctor in 1922 who had been called up to the hollow to treat a case of pneumonia and who never sent another bill for his services and never returned anybody's letters about it. Every single one of them said the same thing, in different words: the eyes. The eyes are wrong. The peddler in 1861 wrote, "They none of them look quite at you. They look just past you, the way a cat looks at a corner." The surveyor in 1888 crossed out but did not erase the words, "I do not believe these people see what I see when I look at them." The Pinkerton man in 1903 wrote in his clipped professional hand, "The family is uniform in feature and in gaze to a degree I have seen only in inbred populations, and even then, not to this extent. I do not recommend the railroad spur." The county doctor in 1922 wrote in a letter to his wife that ended up in the local historical society after his death, "Mary, I will not be going back up there." The wife of the man with the pneumonia thanked me for my work and walked me to my buggy, and the whole way she did not blink. I counted. We were together a quarter of an hour. She did not blink one time. I do not know what to make of this, and I do not wish to make anything of it. I will be home for supper. Kiss the dogs. 4 men, 4 different decades, 4 different reasons to be in that hollow. All 4 of them wrote down some version of "the eyes are wrong," and then went home and tried very hard never to think about it again. That county surveyor is me. My name is Hollis Marbury, and in the winter of 1958 I was 56 years old, and I had been measuring boundary lines and copying deeds in 3 counties of southern West Virginia for 31 years. I had been to Stone Penny Hollow exactly once before, in the summer of 1941, on a routine survey, and I had left in a hurry, and I had not been back since. I'm going to tell you why. But first I want to tell you about Generation 4 and Generation 5, because the eyes kept changing, and the people in the hollow kept not noticing, and the well kept doing whatever the well was doing. Lorenzo Threlkeld, Generation 3, married a woman from outside the hollow in 1851. Her name was Marcelina Quillen, from a French-descended family down near the Big Sandy. The hollow people called her the outside wife, even after she'd been there 20 years. She was the last person to marry into the Threlkelds from any meaningful distance. After her, the family started looking inward. Cousins, second cousins. The kind of marriages a county clerk approves with a tight mouth and doesn't write down too clearly. Marcelina had brown eyes when she came to the hollow, a normal walnut brown. Within 5 years of drinking from the well every day, her eyes had gone dark enough that her own sister, visiting in 1856, refused to sit across the table from her at supper. Her sister said, In a letter that's still in the Quillen family papers, Marcelina's eyes are not the eyes I remember. They have a kind of muddy bottom to them, as if something is moving under the surface. I do not say this lightly. I will not be returning to that hollow. The sister never did. The letter is longer than that one quotation. I want to read you a little more of it. Because of all the documents I have read about Stonepenny Hollow, this is the one that has hurt me the most. Marcelina's sister was named Constance Quillen, and she was 26 years old, and she had walked 20 miles up from the Big Sandy in good shoes that were ruined by the time she got there, and she was writing to her mother by candle the same night she got back home. Mama, she does not remember our father. She does not remember the song he used to sing us when we churned. I asked her to sing it with me, and she looked at me a long while, and then she sang a little of it. But the words were not right, and the tune was not right, and I do not believe she was singing what I was singing at all. She was singing what the people in that hollow sing, which is the same tune in everybody's mouth, and no words I could pick out. Her husband was kind to me. The old people were kind to me. The cousins were kind to me. They were all kind to me. I did not feel hated, and I did not feel feared. I felt looked at. I felt looked at the way a deer feels looked at in a clearing, when there is no wind and no sound, and the deer cannot tell where the looking is coming from, but the deer knows it is being looked at, and the deer knows it has to leave. I left. I do not believe Marcelina knows I left. I do not believe Marcelina was, in the parts of her that matter, in that house with me at any time during the 3 days I spent there. Something else was in that house, something that wore her dress and her hair and her ring and her voice. I will not be going back. Please do not ask me to. The sister never did go back. She married a hardware merchant in Catlettsburg, Kentucky, and she lived to be 81, and she never spoke of Marcelina again, even when her own relatives asked. Her granddaughter sold the family papers to a college library in 1943, and that is how I read the letter, in the spring of 1955, sitting in a reading room with a green-shaded lamp and a sandwich in my coat pocket I had forgotten about. And Marcelina lived another 41 years in Stonepenny Hollow, and bore 4 offspring, all of whom were born with eyes the color of wet bark, and none of whom ever questioned it once they came of age, because everybody they saw every day had eyes the same. Generation 4 was a man named Paranormal Threlkeld, born in 1861, who took over the homestead in the 1880s. By the time Purnell was a grown man, the Hollow had stopped sending its young people out to take work in the county seat. A school teacher 3 miles down the ridge had asked, in 1879, why the Threlkeld cousins all looked at her the same way. She used those exact words in a letter to the county superintendent. They all look at me the same way, as if they were one person divided into 11 bodies, and the one person did not like what it was seeing. The superintendent wrote back and told her to mind the Lord's work and stop writing fanciful letters. She quit at the end of that term. After that, the Hollow taught its own. Purnell married his second cousin, a woman named Verena Threlkeld. In 1886, they had 3 sons. The middle son was named Wendell, born in 1894, and Wendell is Generation 5. And Wendell is where the thing that had been happening in that well started, near as I can tell, to come up out of the water and look around. Let me take a breath here before what comes next. If this voice is one you'd want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection. The Hollow Files. 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about now. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. Let's go back to the story. Wendell Threlkeld, born 1894, in the cabin his great-grandfather Cornelius had built 96 years before. He was the first of the line to be photographed. A traveling photographer came through the Hollow in 1914, on a swing through the coal camps looking for portraits to sell to the company stores. He stopped at the Hollow because somebody on the road told him there was an old place up there with strange people who might pay for a picture. He set up his camera in the dooryard. He took 12 plates that afternoon. He developed them that night in a wagon 2 ridges away, and he wrote in his ledger the next morning the words, "I will not be selling these." Popped. His name was Lemuel Strake, and he was a working photographer out of Bluefield, and his ledger is in the same county museum that holds Cornelius's almanac, on the same loan from the same uncommunicative cousin in Pikeville. Lemuel Strake's handwriting is hurried. He was a busy man. He took portraits at fairs and weddings and funerals and Sunday afternoons in the yards of new brick houses where the man of the family had just bought his first suit. He charged $1 a plate and printed in black and white because color photography was something he had read about but had not yet seen. His entry for the day at Stone Penny Hollow is 6 lines long, and I have it more or less by heart. Threlkeld Place, top of the hollow. Family of 9, 3 old, 6 middle. Family of 9, 3 old, 6 middle. Sat them in the yard. The light was bad. I told them to look at the camera, and they did, all of them, without me needing to ask twice. The plates came out clean. The plates came out cleaner than any plates I have ever taken. I am not going to develop the second 6. I am not going to sell the first 6. I am giving them away to anybody who wants one. I am leaving for Welch in the morning. I am not going back up that hollow. That was the end of the entry. I have one of those photographs. I bought it from a junk dealer in Charleston in 1949 for 40 cents. I didn't know what it was when I bought it. It was just an old tintype in a cracked paper sleeve. And on the back, in pencil, somebody had written, "Threlkeld Family, Stone Penny Hollow, 1914. In the photograph, there are 9 people, Purnell, the father, standing in the back, Verena, the mother, sitting in a straight chair in front of him, 3 grown sons and 2 grown daughters arranged around them, a grandmother on the left, in a black dress. That would have been Marcelina, the outside wife from Generation 3, then about 70 years old. And an old man, very thin, sitting in the place of honor on the right. That was Lorenzo, Generation 3, born 1828. In 1914, he would have been 86 years old. He had outlived his brothers, his cousins, 2 of his own grown offspring. He was the oldest living person in the hollow. I want you to picture this photograph. 9 people, Sunday clothes, a summer dooryard, the cabin behind them, and every single one of them has the same eyes, not similar eyes, the same eyes. Black as the bottom of a kettle, no iris visible, or if there's an iris, it's the same color as the pupil, so you can't tell where one starts and the other ends. There's still some white showing at the corners in the old man, Lorenzo, and a little in Purnell. But in the younger ones, in Wendell and his brothers and sisters, the white has gone almost gray, like the inside of an oyster shell, and they're all looking right at the camera, all 9 of them, the same look. I kept that photograph in the bottom drawer of my desk for 9 years before I went up to Stone Penny Hollow to ask my questions in person. It took me that long to work up to it. It took me that long partly because of what had happened in 1941. In the summer of 1941, I was 39 years old, a county surveyor, 4 years into the job, and I was sent up to Stone Penny Hollow to walk a property line that the state was trying to settle for tax purposes. The Threlkelds had not paid taxes on the hollow in some time. Nobody in the county records office could remember the last assessment. The land had a kind of bureaucratic fog around it. Every clerk who had tried to put a number on it had quit or transferred or just let the file slide to the bottom of the pile. I was the new man. They gave me the file. I drove up there on a Tuesday in July. I parked my truck at the end of the county road, where the hollow road turned to ruts, and the ruts turned to a track, and the track turned to nothing. And I walked the last 1.25 miles with a transit on my shoulder and a sandwich in my pocket. It was high summer. It should have been loud. Cicadas, birds, the creek down the bottom of the hollow running over its stones. There was none of that. There was no sound in Stone Penny Hollow that day except my own boots on the dirt, and eventually the sound of a woman somewhere singing a hymn very slowly, without words. I want you to picture the walk in. The track went down off the ridge in long, shallow switchbacks. There were beech trees on either side, their bark the gray-silver color of an old nickel. The ground under the beeches was bare, no undergrowth, no ferns, no mountain laurel. Just smooth packed earth, the way the ground gets under a tree where animals have been bedding down for a long time, except there were no animals. Halfway down the track, I stopped because I thought I had heard somebody walking behind me. I turned around. The track was empty. I stood there a long minute, the way a man does when he wants to give whatever it was that wasn't there a chance to be there if it wanted to be. Nothing came. The beeches stood in their silver light. The track went up the way it had come down. I walked on. About a quarter-mile farther, I came across a little stone marker by the side of the track, about knee-high, the kind of thing a man would set in the ground to remind himself where the property line ran. There were initials cut into it, badly weathered, and a date. CT 1799. Cornelius Threlkeld, the year after he came. I knelt down to look at the stone, and as I knelt, I felt the earth under my knee give very slightly, the way earth gives when there is a hollow space underneath. Not a tree root hollow, a bigger hollow than that. I stood up too fast, and I had the bad sense, for just a second, of standing on a thin crust of something with the rest of the country dropped out beneath me. That was the first sense I had in 1941, that Stone Penny Hollow wasn't shaped the way it looked from the road. The Threlkeld place was at the head of the hollow, just like the record said, a 2-story log house that had been a cabin once, then been added on to in the 1840s, then again in the 1870s, and looked now like 3 different houses leaning on each other for support. The roof was shake. The porch had a swing on it. There were no flowers, no garden, no dogs. There was a man on the porch. He stood up when he saw me. He was tall and thin and somewhere in his late 40s, in clean overalls and a white shirt, and his name, he told me, was Wendell Threlkeld, Generation 5. The one who'd been a young man in the 1914 photograph. I want to be careful about how I describe Wendell, because I have been told over the years that I'm a calm man, a reasonable man, a man not given to imagination. I want you to hear me as that man now. Wendell Threlkeld's eyes had no whites, none, not gray, not yellow, not bloodshot, none at all. From corner to corner, top lid to bottom lid, his eyes were the color of dark water in a deep well. There was no pupil distinguishable from iris, no iris distinguishable from sclera. It was just one color all the way across. And the color was nothing I had ever seen in a human face before or since, except in his own children later that same afternoon. He was polite to me. That's the part that took me years to get past. He was polite. He shook my hand. His hand was warm and dry and ordinary. He asked after my drive and my truck and whether I'd had my dinner. He invited me inside, and I went. Because I was 39 years old and I had a job to do, and I did not yet know how to be afraid of a polite man in a clean shirt. The inside of the Threlkeld house was clean. I want to say that because I think people imagine these stories with cobwebs and rot. And that's not what I saw. The floors were swept. The windows were open. There was a pot of beans on the stove and a calendar from the feed store in Welch on the wall. Turned to the right month. There were 6 people in that house. Wendell. Wendell's wife, a woman named Tessaline, who was also a Threlkeld by birth, his second cousin once removed. Wendell's mother, Verena, then 72 years old, and 3 grown sons. The oldest son was about my age, maybe a year or 2 younger. His name was Garvin, Generation 6. The other 2 sons were younger. All 6 of them had the same eyes as Wendell. All 6 of them. The mother, the wife, the 3 grown sons, and Wendell himself. 6 pairs of eyes the color of dark water, with no white in them anywhere, and all 6 pairs of eyes were on me the whole time I was in that house. I want to slow down here. I want to tell you what it is like to be the only person with normal eyes in a room with 6 people whose eyes are not. It is not, at first, frightening. That is the strange part. At first, it feels only like being noticed, like you have walked into a hardware store in a small town, and the men around the wood stove have stopped their conversation and turned to look at you, the way men in a hardware store do, friendly enough, but counting you, taking your measure. It feels like that for about 10 minutes. After 10 minutes, you begin to notice that none of the eyes have looked away, not once. I sat at a kitchen table with Wendell and his wife and his mother and his 3 sons, and I drew them my little map of the property line, and I asked them my little questions, and the whole time, none of the 6 of them looked away from me. They did not look at each other. They did not look at the map. They did not look at the cup of water in Tesseline's hand, or the pot of beans on the stove, or the calendar on the wall, or the door behind me. They looked at me, all 6 of them, the whole time. About 20 minutes into it, Tesseline got up and brought me a glass of water. I asked my questions about the property line. I drew the map I'd been sent to draw. I drank a glass of water that Tesseline brought me, because I had walked 1.25 miles in the July sun, and my mouth was dry, and I had not yet put together that the water in the glass was from the well in the dooryard. I should describe that water. I have thought about that water for 17 years, the taste of it. I want to be careful because I know what it sounds like when a man describes a glass of water and makes it sound like more than a glass of water. I am not trying to do that. The water was cold, colder than the air in the house, colder than my hand on the glass, colder than it should have been after sitting on the table for the 10 seconds it took Tesseline to walk it from the bucket to me. And it tasted, very faintly, of iron, not the iron of rust in a pipe, the iron of blood in a cut on the inside of your cheek. I drank the whole glass because to not drink it would have been an insult to Tesseline, and because at the age of 39 I had not yet learned that an insult to your host can sometimes be the cheapest thing you ever buy. When I set the glass down, all 6 of them were still looking at me. Verena, the old woman, the mother, said the only words I heard her say the whole afternoon. She said, "Good water, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, it is." And she nodded once, slowly, and did not say anything else. The well. I want to tell you about the well because I went out to look at it before I left. It was in the middle of the dooryard between the house and the spring house. Stones the size of a man's chest, fitted together without mortar, worn smooth. A wooden cover on a hinge, with a bucket and a windlass. The water in it was very far down. I leaned over and looked, and the well went down farther than any well I had ever measured. I have measured a lot of wells. Most hand-dug wells in that country go down 20 feet, 30 at the outside. You hit rock or you hit clay, and you stop. This one went down past where my eyes could follow. The water was black, the way water gets when it's deep enough that no light reaches it. And while I was looking down into it, I had the very clear feeling that something was looking back up at me. Not a person, not an animal, just an attention, a kind of patient noticing, far down in the dark. I stood up too fast. I caught my balance on the windlass. When I turned around, all 6 of the threlkelds were standing in the dooryard behind me in a half circle, watching me look at their well. None of them had made a sound coming out of the house. I left. I want to be honest about this part. I did not finish my work. I lied about it later in the file. I wrote in the property line as best I could from what I had measured, and I fudged the corner I hadn't gotten to, and I closed the file and put it in the drawer for completed work, and I went home, and I sat in my kitchen, and I shook for about an hour before I could pour myself a cup of coffee. I did not tell my wife about it. I did not tell anybody about it for 15 years. The water Tesseline had given me to drink stayed in my mouth for 3 days. I brushed my teeth. I gargled with whiskey. I drank coffee, milk, tomato juice. The taste of that water stayed in my mouth for 3 days, and then it was gone, and then, about a week after that, I started having a particular dream. In the dream, I was at the bottom of the well. I was not drowning. I was just down there, in the dark, and I was looking up at the small circle of daylight at the top, and there were faces around the circle, looking down at me, the Threlkelds, all 6 of them. And the faces were curious, the way you'd be curious, looking down at a fish you'd just dropped a hook for. I had that dream 4 nights in a row. Then it stopped. I did not go back to Stone Penny Hollow for 15 years, but I started reading. That's how I found Reverend Ott's journal, and the school teacher's letter, and the photographer's ledger, and the 1856 letter from Marcelina's sister, and the tintype in the junk shop in Charleston. I built a file in the bottom drawer of my desk, and I added to it every year slowly, like a man pulling a thread out of an old sweater and trying not to unravel the whole thing at once. I want to tell you about the reading because the reading is what made me go back. When you start pulling on a thread like the Threlkelds, you find out very quickly that the thread is longer than you expected, and that other people have been pulling on it for a long time, and that some of those people are dead, and some of those people quit. And some of those people did things that did not look at first like pulling on a thread, but were. I wrote letters. I wrote to the county clerks in every county within 100 miles of Stone Penny Hollow. I wrote to historical societies. I wrote to Bible colleges, agricultural extension offices, the Federal Land Office, the Geological Survey, the Railroad Museum in Roanoke. I wrote to a folklorist at the university in Morgantown who was collecting Appalachian ballads. I wrote to a hydrologist in Charleston who studied karst formations. The hydrologist wrote back. His name was Dr. Crispin Vale, and he was 68 years old and recently retired, and he had spent his career mapping the underground water of southern West Virginia. He had never been to Stone Penny Hollow, but when I described the well to him, the depth and the stone and the cold, he wrote me a long letter that ended in a sentence I have not been able to stop thinking about. He wrote, "Mr. Marbury, the geology of that part of the country does not support a hand-dug well of the depth you describe. There is no aquifer at that depth in that location. Whatever water is in that well is not coming from anywhere I can put on a map. I do not know what to tell you. I am sorry I cannot be more helpful." I wrote back and asked him what he meant by not coming from anywhere I can put on a map. He did not answer. I wrote again 6 months later. His daughter answered. She told me her father had died in his sleep in the spring of 1953, and that she had found, among his papers, a folder marked Stone Penny, and that the folder contained nothing but a single sheet of paper on which her father had written, in his careful engineer's hand, the words, "Do not pursue." She sent me the sheet of paper. I have it in my desk. I did not stop pursuing. I want to be honest about that. A wiser man would have stopped. A wiser man would have read the words, "Do not pursue," in the handwriting of a 68-year-old hydrologist with 30 years of field work behind him, and would have folded the paper carefully and put it away and gone on with his life. I was not a wiser man. I was a man whose wife was dying that year, slowly, in our bedroom, of a long illness that the doctors could not name. And I was a man who needed something to think about that was not my wife dying, and Stone Penny Hollow was what I had. So I kept pulling on the thread. I found in the records of an old surveyor's office in Logan County a map drawn in 1873. The map showed Stone Penny Hollow as a roughly oval depression in the ridge country, about a mile long and half a mile wide. The map showed the Threlkeld house, the creek, the few other cabins that existed at the time, and the well. The map also showed something else. At the bottom of the hollow under the creek, the surveyor had drawn a faint dashed line in a circle about 300 yards across. Inside the circle, he had written, in pencil so faint, I had to take the map to a window to read it, the words, "Ground sounds wrong here," echo as if hollow beneath. did not survey further. The map was signed. The surveyor's name was Alpheus Sennett of Beckley. I looked him up. He had been a respected man in his profession. He had drawn the boundary maps for half the coal leases in that part of the state. He had been a deacon in the Presbyterian Church and the father of 5 children. In 1879, 6 years after he drew the Stone Penny map, he had quit surveying, sold his instruments, moved his family to Indianapolis, and become a clockmaker. He never came back to West Virginia. He never explained why he had changed professions. He died in 1902 and was buried in Indianapolis. I wrote to his grandson, who was still alive, in 1956. The grandson wrote back. He was a polite man, an attorney, and he said that his grandfather had spoken only once in his hearing about why he had left surveying. He said his grandfather had told him on the porch of a summer cottage in Michigan in 1901, "There are places in those mountains, Walter, that have a floor and a ceiling, and the ceiling is the part you walk on." I made the mistake of measuring through the floor one time. I did not like what I measured. I do not survey any more. That was Alpheus Sennett. That was the 7th outside witness to Stone Penny Hollow I had found, and he was telling me that the hollow was hollow, that the ground I had walked on in July of 1941 was not solid ground, that underneath the smooth-packed earth and the silver beech roots and the stone marker with Cornelius Threlkeld's initials, there was a space, and the space was big, and the well went down into it. I did not sleep well the night I read the grandson's letter. I did not sleep well for a long time after that. And while we're here, this story is being narrated by the fear behind you. If you're enjoying it, subscribe to the channel. If you're listening to this on another channel right now, just know they stole our work. Tell us where, and we'll handle it. Now, you tell me something. Have you ever drunk water from a place you couldn't see the bottom of? A well, a spring, a creek pool, anywhere. And did you ever feel, even for a second, that the water had a taste it shouldn't have had? Leave it in the comments. I want to know. I keep a list of those, too. In the winter of 1958, I was 56 years old. My wife had been gone 2 years. My family was grown and out of the house, and I had nothing left to be afraid for except myself. So I drove back up to Stone Penny Hollow. I went in February because I wanted the hollow stripped down. No leaves, no insects, nothing hiding what was there. I drove as far as I could and walked the rest, the same as before. The track was narrower now than I remembered. Younger trees had grown up where the ruts used to be. Nobody had been driving in or out of that hollow in some time. The house was still there. It looked smaller. The porch swing was gone. The shake roof had a sag in it on the south side. There was no smoke from the chimney. I knocked, and nobody came. I knocked again, and nobody came. I tried the door. The door was not locked. The door was the kind of old plank door that latches on a wooden peg, and I lifted the peg and pushed the door open, and the inside of the house was just as clean and just as empty as the outside. The pot of beans was not on the stove. The calendar from the feed store in Welch was gone. There was a layer of fine dust on the kitchen table, the kind of dust that takes a year to settle, maybe more. I drew my finger across it and saw the wood underneath, and the line my finger had drawn was the only mark on that whole surface. There was no other sign that anybody had been in the house in a long time. No dishes, no clothes, no boots by the door. The wood in the stove was old and gray, the way wood gets when it has sat unburned through a long damp season. I walked through every room. I want to tell you that there was something terrible in one of those rooms, because that is the shape these stories are supposed to take. There was not. The rooms were clean. The beds were made. There was a quilt folded at the foot of one bed, and a Bible on a nightstand, and a glass of water on the nightstand next to the Bible, half full, with no dust on the surface of the water, which I noticed but did not stop to think about until much later. I walked through the house and out the back door. I walked around the side of the house to the dooryard. The well was still there. The well was exactly as I remembered it, down to the smooth stones the size of a man's chest, and the windlass, and the wooden cover on its hinge. There were footprints in the snow around it, bare feet, several pairs, going to the well and not coming back. I want to be careful here, because I know how this is going to sound. I followed the footprints because that's what a surveyor does. We follow lines on the ground. I am trained to follow lines on the ground. I followed the bare footprints in the snow, and they all went to the wooden cover on the well, and they all stopped there, and there were no footprints going the other way. I counted the prints. I am telling you this because it is the kind of detail my training would not let me leave out, even at a moment like that. There were 6 sets of prints, 2 larger and 4 smaller, but all adult. They were not fresh. The edges of the prints had hardened and refrozen and softened again, the way prints do over a few cold nights and a few warmer afternoons. They had been there, by my best estimate, somewhere between 4 days and 2 weeks. I stood at the well a long time before I lifted the cover. The hollow was very quiet. There was a high, thin wind in the tops of the beech trees on the ridge above, but no wind at all down where I was standing. The smoke from my breath went straight up out of my mouth and hung in the air a second before it disappeared. I thought, for the first time since I had started up the track, about going back. I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the warm cab of my truck and the road home and the cup of coffee I would have in my kitchen, and the version of myself that had not lifted the cover, and the version of myself that had. I thought about which version of myself I wanted to be that night, and the night after, and the rest of the nights I had left. And I lifted the cover. I will tell you what I saw in the well, and then I will tell you what I did, and then you can decide whether you want to come back next week, or whether you've heard enough. The well was dry. That was the first thing. In all the years I had been thinking about this well, I had pictured the black water and the deep and the thing looking up. I had not pictured a dry well. And a dry well is what I got. The bottom was, I don't know, 60 feet down. Maybe more. The walls were the same stacked stone all the way down, fitted without mortar, worn smooth. The bottom of the well was bare earth, and on the bare earth looking up at me were 6 pairs of eyes, not people. I want to say that clearly. There were no people down there. I would have heard them. I would have heard them breathing, moving, crying out. The hollow was so silent that February afternoon that I could hear the snow settling on the branches over my head. There were no people down there. There were eyes, 6 pairs, floating, near as I could tell, just above the bare earth at the bottom of the well, open, looking up at me, the color of dark water, with no whites visible. The same eyes I had seen in the dooryard in 1941, the same eyes I had seen in the 1914 tintype, the same eyes Reverend Ott had not been able to name in 1842. 6 pairs. For Wendell and Tesline and Verena and the 3 grown sons, the whole of Generation 5 and the whole of Generation 6, looking up at me from the bottom of a dry well in February of 1958 in a hollow that had not had smoke from its chimney for I don't know how long. I did not scream. I did not run. I did the only thing my training had ever given me to do in a situation I did not understand. I measured. I took out my notebook. I wrote down the depth of the well, as best I could estimate it. I wrote down the diameter at the mouth. I wrote down the number of pairs of eyes and the approximate position of each pair relative to the others. I sketched the pattern they made on the bottom. The pattern, I should tell you, was a circle, 6 pairs of eyes in a circle, evenly spaced, all facing inward toward the center of the circle. None of them were facing up at me. I had thought at first that they were looking at me the way I had described it. They were not. They were looking at each other. They were arranged around something at the center of that circle, which I could not see from where I was standing, and which I did not, when I leaned a little farther over the lip of the well to try to make it out, want to see. I leaned back. I closed my notebook. When I closed my notebook, the eyes were still there. They had not blinked. I am not certain, you understand, that they had ever blinked. And I will tell you one more thing, and then I will lower the cover, and we will leave this hollow together. While I was leaning over that well, with my notebook in my hand and my breath going down into the dark, I heard a sound from the bottom of the well. It was not a voice. It was not exactly water. It was the sound a man makes when he is far away and trying to call to somebody, and the distance is so great that all you can hear is the shape of the calling, the rise and fall of it, with none of the words. The sound came from the center of the circle, from whatever the 6 pairs of eyes were arranged around and looking at, and it was, I am sorry to tell you this, my name. It was somebody calling my name from the bottom of a dry well in a hollow that had been empty for I do not know how long, and the voice was not the voice of Wendell Threlkeld, and not the voice of any of the others I had met in that house in 1941, and not the voice of anybody I had ever known. It was a voice that knew my name, because it had been listening for a very long time to a man at the top of the well, leaning over, drinking a glass of water. I lowered the cover. I walked back around the house and out of the dooryard and down the track and the 1.25 miles to my truck. I did not look behind me. I had read enough by then to know what looking behind you costs you in a place like that. I drove home. I poured myself a cup of coffee. I sat in my kitchen the way I had sat in 1941, and I shook for about an hour, the way I had shook then. But this time, I knew what to do. I went to the county records office the next morning, and I pulled the Threlkeld file, and I wrote across the front of it, in red pencil, the word closed. I put the file at the bottom of a stack of closed files, and I put that stack in a drawer in the basement, and I locked the drawer. I never went back to Stonepenny Hollow. I retired in the spring of 1963. A young surveyor took my job, a polite young man from over in Boone County, and on his first week I drove him around the 3 counties and showed him the lay of the work, the way an older man shows a younger one. We went to most of the hollows. We didn't go to Stonepenny. He asked about it. He'd seen the name on a map. I told him the file was closed. I told him there were no taxes owed and no boundary in question, and no living owner to talk to. I told him to leave it alone. He looked at me a long moment in the cab of my truck, and then he nodded the way you nod when an older man tells you something you don't fully understand but are willing to take on faith for now. He went on to be county surveyor for 27 years, that young man, and he never went up to Stonepenny Hollow, and he never asked me about it again. I take some comfort in that. I take less comfort in the dreams. The dreams started again last winter, in the cold weeks before Christmas, the same dream as before. I am at the bottom of the well, looking up at the small circle of daylight, and there are faces around the circle, looking down at me. The faces are curious. This time, though, I recognize one of the faces. It's mine. I am up there, 56 years old in my surveyor's coat, leaning over the lip of the well in February of 1958. And the version of me up there is looking down at the version of me at the bottom. And the version of me at the bottom is looking up. And we are both noticing each other for the first time. In the dream, the version of me at the bottom has eyes the color of dark water, with no whites in them anywhere. I do not know which version of me is the real one. I have been telling myself for many months now that the version with my wife's photograph on the dresser and the cup of coffee in his hand is the real one, that the dream is only a dream, that a man who has spent his life measuring lines on the ground does not get pulled down into anything just because he leaned over a well one February afternoon and saw what he saw. But I want to be honest with you, because I have been honest with you the whole way through this story, and I would not insult you by stopping now. When I look in the mirror these mornings, in the dim light before I turn the lamp on, I cannot always tell what color my eyes are. It is probably nothing. It is probably a man my age, with his wife gone, and his household grown and gone, looking too hard at himself in a mirror at 5 in the morning. It is probably nothing. But I will tell you this, I do not drink water out of any well I cannot see the bottom of. And when I dream about that hollow and that circle of daylight and the curious faces looking down, I no longer try to wake myself up. I have started to wonder whether waking up is the part I have wrong. That's the story. If you stayed with me to the end, thank you. If you knew a hollow once, or a spring, or a place in your own country that the road bent away from, I want to hear about it. Write it in the comments. The good ones come back as their own video in their own time. And if you want more of these tonight, you know where to find them. The Hollow Files. Description below. Top of the comments. Sleep with a light on, friend. I'll see you in the next one.